Hey friends, this is Alvin Reed again, and I'm finishing up the sessions on reaching and keeping the next generation. As is my custom, I went really long on the first one, but I'm going to wrap it up with several good points I think that'll help you here. To a world that is young. Half the world's population is under 30. 42% of the world's population is under 25. 26% of the world's population, over a fourth of the population of the world is under 15. 10% of the world's population are over 65. Well, I'm 63, so I'm about to be a real minority here. Although that's changing in America somewhat because a lot of us boomers, we're living forever. And I plan to, by the grace of God. But anyway, it is a young generation. Nearly half the world's young live in sub-Saharan Africa. That is an area of the world that is filled with children. And so Mark McCrindle, who I mentioned earlier, said when Gen Alpha have all been born in 2025, they will number more than 2 billion, the largest generation in the history of the world. And so this is the generation you're ministering to right now. And they're, the youngest, the oldest ones of them are like two of my grandkids are now this fall in the sixth grade. They're in youth group, and they're of this generation. Then number 3, you minister to a world that is global and is ethnically diverse. In 1900, 82% of the world Christians lived in the West, in Western Europe and North America, and 80% of them were Caucasian, were white. Today, 39% of Christians in the world live in the West. And in 2050, 71% of the world Christians will be in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So I know you see all the statistics about Christianity declining in America, and it's not quite as bad as they make it. The evangelical population is not in decline. A lot of other are, but the point is this: America is not in super health across the board in the church. But boy, the church is thriving in other places around the world. It is growing in unprecedented ways, and we can give glory and praise to God. The typical world Christian today, 100 years ago, would have been a white dude like me in the West. A typical world Christian today would be a young lady in Latin America or a teenage boy in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a typical Christian in the world today, in the world you minister to. Number 4, you minister to a world of digital natives, but you are a digital immigrant. If you're a millennial or older, you're an immigrant, okay? You've been brought into this digital world, but Gen Z, Gen Alpha, it's as normal to them as anything. And so it means that access to their information, they can fact check everything. They can fact check your messages. If you tell, I did this recently. A guy was telling a story. It was so fantastic. I thought that's amazing. So I Googled it, and guess what? It's an urban myth, okay? It's an urban legend, all right? So young people will check you, all right? So stick with the word, okay? And make sure your illustrations and your points are clear. Greg Thornberry was president of New York University, or King's College in New York, and is really connected with the younger generation. This is what he said. Gen Z, they have TikTok, they have Instagram. They're doing fact checking in real time in a way that no other generation has done so before. And they're reinforced by their heroes. In the 60s, my hero that protested was a guy like Bob Dylan. Today, Taylor Swift is singing a song aimed at right-wing evangelicals, saying, hey, you need to calm down. And so we're seeing this happening. So a lot of Gen Z, Thornberry says, are going to church because their parents make them, but the battle has been lost in the intellectual area. And so it's very important that as we teach young people, we're not lazy. We don't slack. We really give them the word. We go deep with them and help them see the reality. So Gen Alpha, here's a quote. Gen Alpha is part of an unintentional global experiment where screens are placed in front of them. That's why some call them screenagers. From the youngest age as pacifiers, entertainers, and educational age. The great screen age, which we are all living in, has impact on this generation and has exposed them to saturation during their formative years. From shorter attention spans to the gamification of education, from increased digital literacy to impaired social formation, these times impact us all, but transform those who are in their formative years. Quick example. How long did it take to reach 50 million users? Airlines, 64 years. Telephone, 50 years. Computers, 14 years. Television, 22 years. The internet, 7 years. Pokemon Go, 14 days. 50 million users. This is not your granddad's youth ministry. It's not. Number 5, you minister to a generation with increased mental health challenges, anxiety, and depression. Now, I'm going to unpack that some more when I talk about the generations in particular, so I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm gonna pause on that, and we're gonna just kind of wrap this up. But I will go back to that because that's a huge part of this generation. Number 6, you minister to a generation we are losing more than we are reaching. That's another one we're going to talk about more. 50% of boomers, my generation, attended worship services regularly as youth. 52% of Gen X, 45% of millennials, 40% of Gen Z. You see the trend. It's not trending well. In contrast, 18% of boomers were nuns, religiously unaffiliated. 25%, 25% of Gen X, 29% of millennials, and 1/3, 34% of Gen Z are religiously unaffiliated. So if reaching the unchurched and reaching the disconnected and reaching those who are not connected to the church at all is not a part of your ministry, I really would beg you to make that a part of your ministry. Which leads me to number 7. It's like, boy, this could be really discouraging, right? Well, let me give you the last one, number 7. You minister to a generation from the perspective of faith and hope in God. God is sovereign. God's not surprised by generational changes. God's not surprised by things that happen. Every generation offers a promise for revival. Young people, and I've written on this a lot, young people are key to historic revival movements because they're more open to change. So let me give you a quick perspective. In the 60s, there was a civil rights movement. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. There were riots. I mean, there was all that going on. Today, we have division. We had George Floyd killed, his death, and the protest and Black Lives Matter, all that. I'm not commenting on all that. I'm simply saying we live in a day. I will comment on the fact that there's a real issue with race in our culture today, and we have to be aware of that and see the world with the perspective that Eve is the mother of all living. So we're all related, and we ought to treat each other with dignity. More about that. But my point is, there's a lot of things in common today with then. Back then, there was the sexual revolution, the hippie counterculture. Today, we have gender and identity confusion. Sexuality is all over the place. Back then, in the 1960s, there was the avian flu pandemic that globally killed between 1 and 4 million. Today, we're on the backside of COVID-19. So there's a lot of similarities. Well, what happened about 1970 and following? God touched a generation in the Jesus movement. Didn't touch the whole world, but it sure touched me, and it touched a lot of people. All right, let me wrap this up. What if this were the revival generation? Carrie Newhoff, in an interview with Outreach Magazine, said this, quote, well, there are always possibilities because we're talking about the church. In the most optimistic scenario, the church goes into a period of renewal and rebirth. What we know about Gen Z from the data is that the smaller percentage that still go to church are very engaged. My quote, they're on fire. If members of Gen Z are in church, they're very passionate. So perhaps we will see another awakening, a spiritual renaissance in the next generation. And he goes on, this is the chance for Gen Z and Gen Alpha to get it right. I see younger leaders as being passionate about creating a healthy culture because what they've seen in the church has not been a healthy culture. And so that's our hope. And to that, we will turn to talk about those generations.